Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder as I step off the train and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good afternoon, listeners. It's a lovely day here in suburban Chicago. I'm enjoying my walk home. The temperature is in the mid-50s, which is very nice. Not wearing my jacket. Haha. Well, I was thinking about what I would talk about with you today, and I think this might be a thing I'll do moving forward just because I'm lazy and it's useful. I don't know if you recall, a couple weeks ago, I did an episode stealing a topic from the podcast Cardboard Philosophy. Well, today I'm swiping another topic. This is from the most recent episode of the Secret Cabal gaming podcast. Their special topic of discussion was determinism versus randomness. Now, this is something I've certainly talked about on the podcast before. If you go to the show page for this episode over at rattleboxgames.com, you'll find a series of links to other episodes where I've talked about these issues, but I thought it would be helpful to talk about this issue with you here and explore it. So, essentially, what they talked about on the Secret Cabal Gaming podcast was a viewer wrote in and said that they really liked the conversations they've had about randomness and about determinism on the Secret Cabal, and they asked the founders to discuss their absolute favorite games that do the most randomness, the most determinism, and if there are any games that exist in the butter zone exactly between the two extremes. And that's what the group talked about. Now, the founders did elucidate one essential difference that the person making the inquiry didn't really connect with, which was the topic of randomness being, what's the word I'm looking for? That randomness functions in two ways in games. That randomness functions as a setup mechanism or as an outcome mechanism. Now, what's interesting is if you listen to the podcast, they get these terms backwards. At least about 95% sure they did. I looked it up. I definitely know that I'm using them correctly, but from what I heard, it sounded like they were using them incorrectly. So I'm going to define a couple terms first. In game design, there is a phrase. There are two terms, input randomness and output randomness. The input and output have to do with when the randomness of the game manifests in relationship to the decisions the players make. The part that the Secret Cabal got wrong is which one means what. As far as I've been able to tell, input randomness is where the game produces the randomness, it inputs it before you make your decision. The game includes the randomness, it comes in, you make your decision. Output randomness is you make your decision and then the randomness comes out of that. That's the way I've always remembered it, and that is the way, according to my research, the terms are meant to be used. If you listen to the Secret Cabal podcast, I think they got it backwards. That said, if you just understand that they got the terms backwards, they had a really interesting conversation about this. So I wanted to put in my 2 cents. So to answer the original question of the person who posed it, what is the most random game and what is the most deterministic game? And I think a secondary element is what is the most random input randomness game? What is the most random output randomness game? And what is the most deterministic game? And then is there a game that gets that mix just right? So a lot of different options here. So I thought first I would talk about games that involve input randomness. Now, most Euro games that have some level of randomness at all have input randomness. The example they brought up on the Secret Cabal was Castles of Burgundy. In that game, you roll dice, and then you can spend those dice to do a variety of different things. Because you roll the dice before you take your action, that is input randomness. Though that idea also perpetuates through a number of other elements of a Castles of Burgundy. It determines which tiles come out into the depots. It determines which tiles come out into the market to purchase. And those three things together set up different situations in which you have to react tactically and somewhat strategically to the randomness that the game creates for you. So in terms of pointing to a game that has a fair amount of input randomness, I think Castles of Burgundy is a great call. The couple other games I would point to that have a similar thing, deck builders that use a river of cards to purchase, like Harry Potter Hogwarts Battle, involves input randomness in two ways. One, there's a river of cards that you're buying. Two, actually three ways, I guess. One, Harry Potter Hogwarts Battle involves input randomness in three different venues. One, it has the river of cards that you can purchase from. Two, it has the villains that come out. You don't ever know what order they're going to come out, except that Voldemort will be last. And three, the cards coming out of your deck that you have shuffled. So all three of those things, they all happen before you take your turn. They're all input randomness. And then you respond to those situations with your decisions. So I would point to most deck builders as having a very high degree of randomness that's input randomness. That said, most of these games people don't think of when they think of like a really random game. They often don't talk about those games. I would say perhaps the highest version of input randomness that I can think of is Carl Chudik's Motainai. Now in Motainai, you have a wide variety of different things you can do with your cards, and the cards have a variety of different things that they can do, but you never know which cards you're going to get and when. There are a number of different ways to draw cards, but when you get them, you never know quite what they're going to be, and since each one has a different power on it, you're acting extremely reactive to the cards that you draw. I would accept, and without too much vigor, argue that Innovation has a similar level of randomness as part of its construction, because that game is also full of cards that have a variety of different figures on them. So for input randomness, there we go. I think the extreme would be Motainai or Innovation. With regard to output randomness are games where the result is determined by the randomness. Now, one way to do this would be to focus on games that are entirely about output randomness. Perhaps the most output random game I can think of is Strike. In Strike, you're rolling dice into a bowl, and you're seeing if your dice match. If the dice match in pairs or triples or whatever, if you ever have more than one dice that matches, you get to pick it up. If the dice don't match, then you leave them in there. Or if you roll the X, the die is removed from the bowl. And you're allowed to keep rolling into the bowl as long as you want, but if you run out of dice, you lose the game. It is an entirely random game with almost no control. The only decision you get to make is, do you throw a die or dice into the bowl or not? So very, very random. That might be the most random game I could point to, but it's also barely a game because of that randomness. If you wanted to find a couple more games that were a little more gamey that I really enjoy that work on this output randomness, often push your luck games depend on output randomness, because part of what you're trying to do is decide how long do I keep relying on randomness to keep the game going. So a game like Quacks of Quedlinburg or Ink and Gold, these are output randomness games, and I think very successful in it. The other kind of game that I like that has output randomness are Ameritrash games, particularly those from Flying Frog Productions, which focus on a classic style of playing a game that has a variety of results that you're trying to achieve, and they all happen via die rolls. So I really like in Last Night on Earth or in A Touch of Evil how you're going to roll a die, and that die will determine what happens in the outcome of your play. You get some things to mitigate the result, but not very many. And often just a bad roll is a bad roll is a bad roll. So I would point to, if I'm going to say a game that uses output randomness the most, it's going to be Last Night on Earth or A Touch of Evil as my favorite game that has tons of output randomness. I was thinking a little bit about deterministic games. On one hand, there are games that are absolutely deterministic but not very interesting for this conversation, particularly chess and Go and checkers. But we don't really want to talk about those in this context. So it does beg the question, what would be my top deterministic games. And I can think of 3 that I wanted to suggest. The first is one that they did mention on the Secret Cabal, and that is Small World. Now, Steve brought that game up in the context of output randomness, or input randomness, I guess, because the factions that you're choosing are determined randomly. So when you are choosing your faction, there's this line of factions that have been put out, and which pairings are in that line is random. That said, that aspect is determined well before you make your choice. So at best, it's input randomness. But that's a very small part of the game. The main thing of the game is, where do you choose to go? What do you choose to do? The entire context of the game is presented in fullness, and you know what's going to happen. You can make choices based on the pieces you have. You know exactly how the battles are going to go out before you do them. This is the epitome of determinism, and I think it works really well. So one of my favorite deterministic games would be Small World. There are 2 other games that I would point to that are not chess or checkers, but also feel deterministic. Okay, there's a few more games I would point to that feel deterministic. One of them is the game, and this is interesting because the uncertainty comes from the other players, which is true of like chess as well. This is the game Strife. Now, if you're a long-time listener to the podcast, you know I mention this game once or twice a year. It is a card game where you're choosing your cards and playing them against your opponent, and all the cards interact in specific ways. So you know what your card is going to do, you know what their card is going to do. The uncertainty comes from you not knowing which card they're going to pick. But it is a perfect information game. You know exactly which cards they have because you have those same cards. You can always see all the cards they've played, so it's a perfect information game, even if it's not perfect certainty. I can't remember what term Tony used in the podcast. But Strife would be an example of another game that has no randomness, but nonetheless feels like it has some. And then you have 3 games that are sort of from the model of chess or checkers, but are in fact new hobby games. And those would be Onitama, Cairn, and That Time You Killed Me. Now Onitama, you could argue, has a little bit of uncertainty in it because the cards that you have at the beginning of the game are secret from your opponents, and they don't know which card you have until after you've played it. So that tiny piece of Onitama is uncertain, but not random. One of the players has access to it and gets to control it. And then you get 2 other games that are much more abstract, but fully perfect information, and that is Cairn and That Time You Killed Me. Both Cairn and That Time You Killed Me are games where you know exactly what the opponent can do, and you're just trying to anticipate and outplay them. These are games that feel most like chess or checkers or other games of similar ilk, even if they have their own uniquenesses. And those would be games that are the epitome of determinism. Well, that brings me to the end of my walk. I did not come up with an answer for the buttery smooth middle game, so I leave it to you, listeners. Pickers up and deliverers, putters. I don't know what we're calling you. Did we decide that? Contribute to that conversation or to the question of which game falls right in the middle by heading to Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and sharing your thoughts over there. Thanks for joining me on my walk today. I hope your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.